Hello, I'm Kent Chamberlin, and I'm a special expert for the International Commission for the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. And I became involved with ICBE because of my background in electromagnetics, biomedical engineering, and because I served on a state commission that I'll tell you a little bit about. The point of the commission was to explore the health and environmental impacts of wireless radiation. So it was a really good match for ICBE. When I joined the commission, I was the chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. It's important to note that when I joined the commission, I didn't think that wireless radiation was a problem in terms of health or the environment. But when I joined the commission, I found out something very different. So I've made mention of the commission. Let's talk about it. The New Hampshire Commission was formed because legislators were being told by their constituents that they were being harmed by wireless radiation and that they had the scientific evidence to back it up. These same legislators were being told by industry, the telecom industry, that wireless radiation was totally harmless. And so the legislators decided that, tried to figure out what was going on. It's a complex issue. And they thought that the only way they could discover the truth about the issue was to form an impartial state commission comprised of experts. So they wrote a bill, and a legislation. That legislation passed both houses of the legislature and was signed by the governor. So it was a formal state commission. And in the final analysis, we ended up with the expertise to answer questions, the questions being posed to us. We had experts in medicine, physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, that's me, epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health. So we had all of the expertise that you would expect to need to answer questions about wireless radiation exposure. So what we did, we met for over a year, and we took a deep dive into any information we can find relating to wireless radiation and harm, and we started with the peer-reviewed literature. Now, I acknowledge that not all peer-reviewed literature is correct, and so one of the things we did was we did a thorough search to make sure that anything that we used to come to draw conclusions was accurate. So that's what I mean by the commission vetted for the review, the literature review. So what I can say with confidence is all of the information we used from the journals to draw our conclusions was accurate. Now, we also invited government officials to join with us, such as the Federal Communications Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency. You'd think that as a state commission, a formal state commission, that we could get government agencies to work with us, but they didn't. And we later found out why not. We found out about the very cozy relationship between some of these agencies and the government and industry. So they just did not meet with us, and they really didn't answer any of the important questions that we posed to them. We also brought in outside experts, people with international reputations regarding their knowledge of exposure to electromagnetic fields and health. So of the 9 experts we brought in, 8 of them documented the harms of wireless radiation, and the one person that we brought in, one outside expert that we brought in, who said that wireless radiation was harmless, was the person brought in, the expert brought in by the telecom industry. And it's also notable that this is the only person that was paid to come present to our commission. Everybody else did so on a voluntary basis. So, and the result of the peer-reviewed publication review is that we found hundreds of top-tier journals that talked about, or they had articles that talked about harm from wireless radiation. And the telecom industry will claim that the radiation is completely harmless, and that's because it would lower their profits to comply with more reasonable standards. And they then have made a statement that I've heard many times on many occasions, is that the only studies showing harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. Well, we did not find that to be the case. In fact, the majority of the publications that we found regarding some of these issues, like oxidative stress, the majority, over 90%, showed that free radicals are associated with exposure to low level fields, like the fields that you would get from a nearby cell tower or from your own cell phone. So, oxidative stress is something that is, I think, that most people recognize as being a problem because oxidative stress leads to free radicals. Those free radicals can cause inflammation and a host of diseases, including cancer. So, when we found out as a commission that there were problems with exposure to fields, we wanted to find out how the standards were being set, the standards that were being enforced by the FCC. And so we found out that those standards were set back in the 1980s and were based on animal studies. And these are short term studies. So remember, what I'm talking about here are the guidelines that are put in place for our 24/7, 365 exposure. And yet, these studies to determine what those limits should be were lasted less than an hour. So completely flawed from the very beginning. And what they assumed here is that the only problem with exposure to electromagnetic fields is not long-term exposure, but the short-term heating effects that can happen from wireless radiation exposure. Now, an example of that is your microwave oven. You put food in the microwave oven and it gets warm. And clearly that's a problem, but that is not the only problem. It's the long-term exposure that over time does have an impact, and that's very well proven. So the way the study went is that they took these animals, in particular 8 rats and 5 monkeys, and they were taught, first of all, trained to push a lever to get food. And then at the beginning of the study, these animals were food deprived. And so they put these animals in cages, and the animals were pushing the lever to get food because they were food deprived. And they kept turning up the radiation exposure until finally the animals couldn't perform that task anymore. And that was designated as being the threshold dose. It's worth mentioning that some of the monkeys had burns on their faces at that level of exposure. So then the experimenters divided that threshold dose of radiation, the radiation that caused burns, and they divided that by 50. It's a completely arbitrary number. They didn't have any relative risk that they were targeting. They just said, well, here's a maximum. Let's divide that by 50, and that should be adequate for the public in general. By the way, they only divided that number, that threshold dose, by 10 for workers. So we're talking about very high levels of radiation and only the protection against short-term exposures. So some of our recommendations are what you would expect if you were on a commission and you discovered that something caused harm. Well, one thing you should do is you should have your agencies coordinate. This is kind of a no-brainer, but coordinate to protect the people, wildlife, and the environment from what we found out in the commission, what we found out caused harm. That should be better regulated. Also, we found that Congress should require the FCC to do an independent study. A lot of these studies that have been done by industry. And even those that are done by industry, some of them are showing harm as well. But much or most of the independent studies, the independent research into this area show harm, very definite harm. We also found that the National Environmental Health Policy should also be looking at this and being more active. There's plenty of evidence, and I didn't have time to go into it here, that exposure to electromagnetic fields can affect plants, wildlife. Trees are affected. If the trees near towers tend to be less healthy and will die over a long enough period of time. We then, and a very important thing, and I want to leave you with this very important thing, and that is there's a lot you can do to protect yourself. When engineers were told to design wireless systems, they weren't told to minimize radiation. They were told to make these devices fast. So if we engineers now look at this again, there are a lot of things that can be done to significantly lower radiation and allow us to continue using these devices we've come to depend upon. such as our cell phones. So on that note, I'll leave my presentation. Thank you.